A Guatemalan and a Canadian walk onto a stage to talk about elections.
Thanks for having us on.
Yeah?
Oh yeah.
Wait, there we go. So, I'm Carlos Toriello. My claim to fame is I lead the election auditing effort in Guatemala that became the first to audit our elections in real time using Bitcoin. And because of this activism work, it led and inspired some people at tamper-proof to convince the election authorities to use Bitcoin to protect our voting system, making Guatemala the first country in the world to protect its voting system with Bitcoin.
And I'm Peter Todd. I've done some Bitcoin development, and a couple of years back I spent a few weekends making open timestamps.
So it's a real pleasure to be with you all, and let's start with the basics. What is a timestamp? Does everyone here know what that is? So the concept is old as time itself. It's just the human need to identify when something happened, right? In antiquity, you can find many examples of these in ancient civilizations. More recently, the famous stamps that you get when you go to the government, and now that we don't have analog and paperwork, we don't really recall that, that stamp was the only proof that you have that you actually gave something to a certain authority, right?
Of course, analog timestamps tended to have the property that they were horrendously insecure or pretty much useless. It's only really with cryptography can we make things that actually work properly.
And so why is this important? Well,
bad guys don't have time machines. And, as funny as that may sound, what it really comes down to is in so many situations, if you could say when data was created, or at least the data was created sometime before that point, you can rule out an attack, because the attacker could only do the bad thing, modify the data, manipulate it, whatever, after some point in time. We'll give an example with elections, but a really simple example that Bitcoin Core and other Bitcoin software uses is the digital signatures we use just to verify you're getting the right data. You're not getting some hacker-produced thing. Well, sometimes people leak their keys, and timestamps are used to make sure that in the future, even if the keys get leaked, hacked, whatever, hey, this was created prior to when that happened, and it's still good software.
So having proof that something happened at a specific moment in time, if someone were to create a counter proof to that afterwards, the easiest way to spot an attacker is the fact that that happened afterwards. But the important thing, though, is how could you tell when that happened, and can you trust it?
Yeah, and open timestamps is my project, and the idea of using Bitcoin for timestamping has been around for a very long time. Probably, even 2010, even 2009, probably someone pointed it out. But the issue with the idea of using it, of course, well, first of all, you can do this because Bitcoin blocks have a time field. And I'm not going to get into the nuances of what that means, but, if you can prove data fed into a Bitcoin block, was mathematically linked to the Bitcoin block in a way that the Bitcoin block was dependent on it, well, you can go prove that that data existed prior to that block. Open timestamps is just free to use infrastructure, to use scalability techniques like Merkle trees to let anyone get their data linked into a Bitcoin block for free. And if you go to opentimestamps.org, long story short is you can just make a timestamp proof. And because it's so efficient, there's a service that we just offered for free with volunteers running the infrastructure behind it with open source software.
And so, raise your hand if you've heard of open timestamps. I don't see enough hands, because open timestamps is at this point a kind of almost one of the only things that most Bitcoiners agree on and use. But new people, you should know that this tool has been around since 2016, thereabouts, and it's very easy for you as an individual if you ever have information that's important to you, say for example a marriage certificate, an important piece of artwork that you created, something digital that is yours, that is important to prove that you are the first person in the universe to have this. Visit opentimestamps.org. It's incredibly easy to use for individuals, and when I first heard about it, I realized this could be incredibly powerful if I ever had to encounter some tricky situations. But before we go into that, why timestamp the Bitcoin?
And I mean, this is a Bitcoin conference. I probably don't need to convince you too much that Bitcoin is one of the most secure computer systems out there. And when you get down to it, like, timestamping is not a new thing. Cryptographic timestamping is not new. In fact, the term blockchain, the invention blockchain, that was originally created for cryptographic timestamping systems. But the catch of all these systems was they were all relied on trust. Even something like guard time, ultimately, they signed the timestamps. You had to trust guard time not to lie. They used blockchain in very limited ways to do kind of dodgy things like, put a hash in literally like a newspaper advertisement to provide some kind of traceability. But the difference with Bitcoin is any one of us can just run a Bitcoin node. I mean, you could just walk down to the Start9 booth and just buy one of their pre-made nodes and run it tomorrow. And you would then be participating in the wider network that validates Bitcoin blocks. And since we have this massive system that's so easy to use, well, why wouldn't you go and do your timestamps for Bitcoin? Why would you involve trust when you don't have to? Like, it's sometimes hard to argue for this because it just seems so obvious. You have one solution where you involve a bunch of trust, another one where you don't. Obviously, you might as well use a free thing where you don't have to involve trust. Of course, if I were, CEO of guard time, I might say something different because my job depends on it, but that's another matter.
Chancellor on the brink of the second bailout of banks. Who's heard that before? Well, that's a timestamp. And famously, Satoshi used what was up until the time one of the most common ways to refer to a timestamp, which is referencing a newspaper's front page, which was the front page from the Financial Times, right? In was it January 3rd or so. Chancellor on the brink of the bailout of banks. Famously, Satoshi from the first message on the chain is a timestamp, and so we know for a fact that Bitcoin was, through Satoshi, used it as a timestamp, proving that the Genesis block happened at least at that moment. However, using a newspaper, well, potentially a newspaper could come out with a front page ahead of time to try to attempt to use it as a timestamp. So you always have this trust issue. The beautiful thing about Bitcoin is, for the first time, we can use it as a time chain and no longer need to trust anyone, but use a trust minimized or even almost trustless network to trace our digital data to a specific moment in time. And so that inspiration is what led us in Guatemala to use Peter's tool. And we didn't quite expect how things would turn out. So what I'm showing on the screen is the smoking gun evidence presented by the Guatemalan Election Crimes Unit of the justice system, proving to them, according to them, that election fraud was committed in the June 2023 elections. What you are seeing on the y-axis is the number of files that reached the internet, while on the x-axis is 0 hours on election day, all the way through almost 2 days. And what they're saying is the polls closed in Guatemala on 6 p.m., and so 3% of the data in its metadata in the JPEG contained timestamps that existed prior to the polls closing. This was extremely concerning and is literally what they are presenting in court right now to argue that our election authorities committed election fraud. It was very concerning, and obviously our teams cared was, sprung up. However, since the election authorities contracted a startup called Simple Proof, in the orange, what you are being shown now is the timestamps that actually exist on Bitcoin. And so this presents a very different case to what was in the metadata of these JPEGs, suggesting that something happened. And so basically, if Bitcoin has this bell curve around the midnight hour on election night, and that's where the files from the election were created, well, we can't really say anything about the past in that 3%, but we can surely call into question this much larger piece of data that somehow existed in the future while Bitcoin already proved it in the past.
And maybe I'll just jump in for a second. I mean, think about, how like a paper ballot election works. You have millions of physical paper ballots. They get stuck in boxes. The boxes get taped up. And then soon after, they get opened up again, and we start counting them. If everything's going correctly, you would expect the counting process to end pretty soon after the election polls stop because, counting a bunch of ballots is pretty easy, and it's done in parallel. And the sheets saying, hey, how many people voted for what candidates at these polling stations, they should be fed into the system and scanned pretty quickly. That's where the timestamps happened. And of course, the election authorities are basically saying, hang on a second, there's this big suspicious group of things getting timestamped, way later. Like maybe, someone was like spending a couple hours manipulating the ballots, but...
So of course, if you consider this, then there are only two plausible explanations. Either time travelers were able to use their powers and Rick and Morty style travel back in time to introduce data into the Bitcoin blockchain, or something more plausible, which is there was a time zone misconfiguration where 53% of the hardware thought that it was in Iraq, in Baghdad, and 3% of the hardware thought that it was in American Samoa in the Pacific Islands. When you consider a very simple time zone error and misconfiguration mistake, Occam's razor says the simplest explanation is more often the right one. Well, someone made a mistake, misconfigured the hardware, but as a result created the impression that election fraud occurred. Had they not used Bitcoin, we wouldn't have an independent source of data that allows anyone who cares to believe in mathematics to consider this more plausible explanation. And when you correct that time zone, it turns out that this small 3% and this large 53% matches exactly with what's on Bitcoin.
Basically, the evidence shows that the boring thing happened. A bunch of boxes were opened, people counted them, scanned in the results, and that's that. And, timestamps provide very good evidence because you say, hey, all of this was submitted prior to these Bitcoin blocks, and unless you think Bitcoin is screwed up itself, well, it all happened when we expected it to happen.
So that's how you avoid a shit show, because a simple mistake by a technology operator almost meant the end of our democratic republic in Guatemala.
I mean, like, quite literally, it could have ended in a civil war of people arguing over what side the election results should have been.
So allowing such a simple mistake to all of a sudden draw your country into civil war because you cannot trust clocks would be, sad. And so, fortunately, Simple Proof, the company that I now work for, offers cheap CYA insurance to ensure that we can avoid this kind of shit show. But that's one of the reasons to do this. It's reducing the risk for election authorities and, of course, communities writ large that are the ones that are going to bear the fallout. But in addition, there's a very strong commitment on how these authorities stand by their data.
And, you know, I think, like, what I like to talk about is, you know, truth. And, you know, interestingly, I mean, I had a discussion with, I'll just say, one of the leading candidates in this election. You know, their party kind of came to me and asked for some bit of advice on, you know, blockchain technology and so on. And one of the things I said is, like, look, I'm probably not going to actually vote for your candidate, even if I was a U.S. citizen, which I'm not, but we do agree on one thing. We agree on the truth. And as long as you want to go tell the truth, things like open timestamps help you stand by your data, because it's inevitably technology that's only going to help you show, hey, you were telling the truth. You did stand by your data. And, of course, the slide's kind of funny, because commitments is also a cryptographic term that we go use, as in, like, you make a commitment to data, so you can't change it later. Well, as long as you don't want to change your data later, open timestamps can help.
I was an election auditor on election night, very concerned that there could have been bad behavior, let's say. But once I saw that the data was committed to Bitcoin, and the time chain, basically the only and most trustworthy clock that humanity has ever created, is what is anchoring the digital data of my election, my concern level went from up here to down here. It does not eliminate the possibility of election fraud, but it dramatically reduces the attack surface to essentially a single moment in time. When instead of society having to be concerned about fighting over this over years, we can just force would-be attackers to that one moment in time, which would be election night. And so if you force people to go through one moment, then we can all have all of our eyes on there, and that would be a lot harder to get away with. But then the authorities, it means that they can't change their mind either. They remove the ability of any would-be attacker, say a nation state or some group that really is not interested in the truth. But when they do that, they also remove their own ability to change reality after the fact. When I saw our election authorities standing behind the work that they did, for the first time I actually began to start to trust them again.
Yeah, and, you know, this idea that you can verify yourself is, I think, really important, because open timestamps was designed to be something simple enough that anyone with a bit of technical expertise could verify. And of course, first and foremost, like I said before, the important thing about being able to verify yourself is that this is done through Bitcoin. This is done through the same protocol that we can all run nodes on, we can all understand. I mean, maybe not everyone here is technical, but certainly you can go ask, the guy you do know who is, to kind of vouch for it. And it's just math. It's not about trusting some institution. It's not about trusting some authority. It's about trusting math and and economic incentives. And if you go to the opentimestamps.org website, I mean, you could even get a timestamp and actually interrogate what's actually happening behind the hood, what mathematical operations are being performed.
So instead of arguing over opinions and whether or not your guy won or lost, we can focus purely on mathematics and what actually happened. I find that being able to forget about the noise, in the digital age, especially now with the rise of AI, how do we know that anything is real? Maybe because I'm standing here right in front of you, you think I'm not some avatar, maybe. But if you had your own tools to run the mathematics yourself, to prove for yourself, not because you believe me, you believe open timestamps, you believe simple proof, just because you studied the cryptography, sat down by yourself, and you did the work. Being empowered and demanding that election authorities provide us that opportunity instead of just trusting the authority because that's what they said. If they're recovering our trust starts with giving us the ability to not just trust them, but be able to verify. Don't trust, verify. Yeah, why wouldn't you do this? Well, Sounds too good to be true, Peter.
Yeah. Well, I mean, let's look at some possibilities.
There's got to be a bad reason, right?
I mean, obviously, like you don't want to, lead the world on technological adoption. You just want to stay stuck in the past. I mean, open timestamps, like it sounds new, right? I mean, I wouldn't use new things if I didn't really have to.
Guatemala is the first country in the world to protect its voting system with Bitcoin. There has not yet been a second country to adopt this very logical, cheap solution. November is coming up. Are we going to allow the United States to lose the opportunity to become number 2? Or are you going to wait until the rest of the world adopts this and then at that point come along? If that's the new national strategy, I guess, that's a great reason not to do this.
Yeah, I mean, open timestamps, like creating an open timestamps proof is effectively free. But, effectively free is still a lot of money. And, we all look at Guatemala and we just think how rich they are, how beautiful their capital city is. Like you go to the roads outside, you see those wonderful huts. And we just don't have that in America. So, if America just can't afford it, I can understand.
Only 50% of our children are malnourished. So everyone knows we are very wealthy. So, if you can't afford it, I mean, I suppose that's an interesting new bit of information.
I mean, to create the Open Timestamps protocol, it probably took me a total of like 4 or 5 weekends. And for those guys to create an election, it took you, an entire 3, 4, 5 months? I mean, enormous amount of work for a 5-person team.
It was a lot of work. Our election authorities literally asked us, how much is this going to cost us? And when we told them, they said, that cheap? We want 2 of them. They were able to run an entire simulation weeks before implementing it to actually see whether or not this worked or wasn't some magical rug pull that they were going to become disappointed. So Guatemala actually ran the simulation before the game day, proving that at least a country as rich as Guatemala can use this cutting-edge technology.
I hate to say it, though. I mean, the amount of money that was spent on that, it probably would have only bought you one of those big floating hats. And do you want a big floating hat or a secure election?
For sure. Avoiding civil war is definitely not high up on my list, I would say. That hat is too cool. So, There definitely is one big elephant in the room in terms of the concern that a person might have who's in a position to do this. And then the beautiful thing about the United States is, whereas we have one election authority that oversees 9.2 million registered voters, the United States has over 3,000 election authorities because the local governments, through their county clerks, are the ones that actually administer the elections. The feds don't do the elections. It's up to your local county clerk to decide whether or not they are going to risk getting hacked by some group or making a time zone mistake and throwing your community into chaos. But obviously there is another great reason not to do this.
I mean, I think the term stealing, though, it's a little divisive. What I want to go say is, we just want to not use open timestamps because we want to make sure the right person gets elected. We can't leave that to chance. I mean, you guys in the audience, what do you know about who should be president? This whole vote casting thing, I think we should leave it to the experts.
Truth does not care what your political opinion may be. Not doing this only benefits those that have benefited from creating a culture of lies. Regardless about where you stand on this, before the election, we should all at least publicly agree that we want the vote to reflect the will of the people and nothing else. So,
yeah. Thank you.
The work that we did we've known about open timestamps for years. In 2019, a friend recommended that I use it in case I maybe got thrown in jail because maybe I found some information that would contradict what other people would want to know. But working with open timestamps and Peter, we've discovered that nerds like us that understand this need to do a better job at facilitating this for folks that haven't gone as deep down the rabbit hole as we have. So we are incredibly excited at Simple Proof to announce that we are donating part of the tools that we built to facilitate that the general population have an easier understanding of cryptography and mathematics. And so we built this tool called the Open Timestamps Navigator. You can find it at otsnavigator.simpleproof.com. It's a very simple way to use the proofs produced by Open Timestamps to see the Merkle tree and see it in a graphical interface that's simple to understand. But very soon, and by the end of the year, you'll be able to go to opentimestamps.org and hopefully be able to use this as part of the open source stack so that more people can more easily understand the value of timestamps.
And what I love about this is it is about education. It's making sure you can understand how this actually works under the hood. Maybe not as well as like a Bitcoin core dev, but the math isn't that hard, and it's important that we all can understand it to the degree necessary to participate in a democracy.
Bitcoin protects your wealth, and as you're building your family's generational wealth, you should. But Bitcoin now protects democracy in Guatemala. This November, we have the opportunity for Bitcoin to protect democracy in the United States. Come December, if Bitcoin protects democracy in the United States, then if you're against Bitcoin, you must be against democracy. So please, reach out. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Toriello and please Todd.